cases at Dexter and at Hillsdale. Here's one part I do want to read. I want it clearly understood that I'm not making a blanket statement to cover the entire UFO phenomenon over the past 20 years in this and other countries. I'm discussing only the Dexter and Hillsdale sightings, and then only that material which I have been able to sift down and to that which forms a consistent picture.
Doctor, could you face this way more?
Yeah, all right.
Thank you.
I am a huge fan of J. Allen Hynek, not just the man himself, the legend, but of his journey from a skeptic to a skeptical believer.
For instance, the groups of reports came in over several days from different localities. Many of these have nothing whatsoever to do with the sighting at Hillsdale and at Dexter. Now, for instance, yesterday there was released to the press, and I want to make this completely clear that this has nothing whatsoever to do with the two cases I'm discussing.
Hynek's task at Project Blue Book was no easy feat. He had to find a way to explain off the unexplainable.
This picture was released of the rising moon and Venus. This was taken not at the time of the Hillsdale sighting. It was taken several days earlier, not in the evening, but at 5 in the morning at Milan, Michigan, not in Dexter or Hillsdale. This shows you how these sort of investigations could get completely mixed up. Milan, M-I-L-A-N.
Hynek over the years became the perfect example of a healthy skeptic, which is a powerful perspective to have when approaching this phenomenon or any aspect of high strangeness.
Milan, Michigan, not in a swamp, not anywhere near a swamp, but this is without question Venus and the moon. However, I don't want you saying that the Air Force is trying to cover up with a picture of Venus and the moon. This has nothing to do with the Hillsdale and Dexter cases, but it was thoroughly confused by the release made yesterday. Similarly, in Hillsdale, there have been recently, again, nothing to do with the sighting of March 21st. Several boys have been purchasing flares and using those. I am not using that as an explanation, but as an illustration of what happens when a thing like this gets going, a real UFO flap.
In this clip, you can clearly see him using his logic and his intelligence to calm the press. And at the time, that was his main goal. It was what he was being paid to do.
Now, I said here in this statement at the end that I emphasize in conclusion that I cannot prove in a court of law that marsh gas is the full explanation of these sightings.
He was a man who took science first always before falling into the fantasies of the human mind.
But it does appear to me extremely likely, and furthermore, I must read, to back this point up, as I've said here, said that I am, after all, an astronomer and not a chemist.
But this clip, what you're watching now, is one of those moments that changed UFO history forever. His intellect and his brilliance has boxed the phenomenon into a corner. Swamp gas. How many times have we heard that one before?
And I pointed out that swamps are not the normal province of the astronomer. He usually has his eyes trained toward far loftier places. Yet the famous Dutch astronomer Minnaert, in his book Light and Color in the Open Air, has this to say about swamps. He describes lights that have been seen in swamps by the astronomer Bessel and other excellent observers.
Hynek later in his life, and just like he did at the beginning of this press conference, explains that this conclusion of swamp gas is not an explanation for the phenomenon as a whole. But it seems like the press took it that way. Because think about how many times we heard this idea that, oh, it's just swamp gas.
The lights, he says, resembles tiny flames, sometimes seen right on the ground, sometimes floating above it. The flames go out in one place and suddenly appear in another, giving the illusion of motion. No heat is felt. The lights do not burn or char the ground. They can appear for hours, this is all a quotation, they appear for hours at a time and sometimes for a whole night.
See, at the moment in this clip, Hynek is just expressing what he thinks. He's trying to find an explanation for this phenomenon, and this is his best logical approach. And I don't think that he ever thought that this idea or this concept, this explanation, would become a deterrent like it did for so many years to dismiss close encounter cases.
Generally, there is no smell and usually no sound except the popping sound of little explosions, such as when a gas burner ignites. This is precisely what was observed there. There were yellow, green, and red lights that always were around a definite locale. They moved up and down and sideways, but they were always there at that particular locale.
You and I know that some type of military cover-up has been happening for many, many years, all the way from Project Blue Book to ATIP, and J. Allen Hynek to Lou Elizondo. In my opinion, Lou Elizondo is a perfect example of a skeptic that is now a skeptic believer. If you watch Unidentified and you see his approach in season 1, and then you see his approach at the end of this last season, you will see that his expression when it comes to the phenomenon has changed.
In the Dexter Swamp, for instance, while Mr. Manor and his friends were observing the glow from their porch, Fitzpatrick and McFadden were over on the other side of the swamp. They saw the glow to the south, he saw it to the north. It was very well pinpointed.
So let's take a trip into the past and think about how difficult it must have been for Hynek to try to keep his credibility while being a respected astronomer and talk about this subject. We know that today, people are still afraid to touch this subject and take it seriously. And I feel like Lou walks the same line. And that's why you don't see him really getting deep into UFO circles. He's trying to approach this phenomenon without losing his credibility, which is what we all should be trying to do. But at the same time, I think that this phenomenon is an unexplained alien phenomenon, and that our human minds and the barriers of human science may not have the explanations that we need to try to classify what this phenomenon is.
Didn't any of these people actually see a definite shape, though, Doctor?
That's a good point. I've got that covered here someplace. The majority of observers in both cases have reported only lights, red, yellow, and green, silent, glowing lights near the ground. They have not described an object. Even the only 2 observers who did describe an object have stated that they were no closer than 500 yards, better than a quarter of a mile. Now, I doubt that one could make out much detail at that distance at night. It was a dark night, no moon, and by the way, the winds were fairly calm.
You know, Hynek, even in this clip, is showing how intelligent he is. He's trying his best to piece this together and give the press what they want. And he's also trying to do his job. And honestly, if you respect what he did or not, you need to understand that nobody would really want to be in this position. Imagine being in the hot seat and trying to have to explain this phenomenon away. I mean, it seems like such a difficult and impossible task.
Which would be again conducive to this sort of thing.
Doctor, isn't it the nature of swamp gas to remain close to the ground, and especially during a thunderstorm, wouldn't that keep it down? Some of these witnesses have told us that they've seen it.
I feel like credibility is so important for you, for me, for all of us here in this community. I try to not post UFO sighting videos on any of my social media platforms because I feel like anyone can grab that sighting, pick it apart, rip it apart, and I could actually lose some credibility by posting those things. And it's happened where I feel like I've got pushed to the edge, or I've been put on the line because I just wanted to share something and ask the community a question.
Hundreds of yards in the sky.
Some, 1 or 2 witnesses did say that, but the great majority, again, you must remember that I've sifted down all the many reports. I've been talking to these people day after day.
And Hynek is on a level of credibility that I will never reach. I mean, he's a respected astronomer, so imagine a man of science trying to walk this thin line and not lose his respect. I wish Hynek were around today to see where the community is at this moment in time in 2020. To see the gimbal, the Go Fast video, the FLIR video. I'd love to hear his thoughts on TTSA and just the community as a whole.
You cannot simply take every statement made and give it credence. You have to get the least common denominator of these statements. And when you do that, then I was able to get from them that the lights appeared to rise somewhat and descend, not many times, a few times during the course of the evening. Both the Hillsdale girls and the people at Dexter described the glow of the lights behind the trees as though they would get brighter and dimmer, as though stage lights were being turned up with a rheostat, as they do in stage lights.
See, because of people like Hynek that dedicated their life to this subject, I will never stop searching for the truth. I respect the old guard, and I will always be a skeptical believer. A blind skeptic has no power in this community, and a blind believer is just the same. So always stay skeptical, but always try to understand that you cannot let your skepticism get the best of you. And always, when you are a believer, don't let that blind you from seeing the truth.
None of them, except those two people, Mr. Manor and his son, no one else described an object, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen.
Are you saying, Doctor, that Michigan is now producing non-existent saucers?
Well, it's one way of putting it, I suppose.
Doctor,
How many people did you?
Several dozen all told.
Doctor,
Several dozen.
Several dozen.
Doctor, you refer in your statement to the will of the wisp. Is there a difference between this and marsh gas, or was this another will of the wisp?
It's another name. Miasma is another name. Sometimes I believe, but I'm not sure of this. Foxfire. I believe that is another name for it.
Doctor, is there a possibility that flying saucers do exist, though?
It depends on how you define this now. What do you mean by a flying saucer?
An unidentified object from outer space? I think that's the popular conception.
That would be the popular conception. Certainly I have no scientific evidence this is so, and I would be delighted to have some, really, if I could. You would just think how exciting it would make things. Let's remember in this thing that I am not talking about the whole subject of UFOs. I was sent here to check these two particular cases. And the whole subject of UFOs, I pointed out, I think, and I have, let me mention here, that I have recommended in my capacity as scientific consultant that competent scientists quietly study such cases when evidence from responsible people appears to warrant such study. There may be much of potential value to science in such events. We know a very great deal more about the physical world in 1966 than we did in 1866. But by the same token, the people in the year 2066 may regard us as very incomplete in our scientific knowledge. We must not, in our haste to have answers, be Freddie Smith. Now, somebody asked me who Freddie Smith is, please.
I love this Freddie Smith example here at the end. I think it's a great example of how the scientific community has approached the UFO phenomenon for so many years. Nobody wants to touch it. Nobody wants to look deeper than they should into this subject because they do not want to lose the respect of their peers. But I believe that this phenomenon is so deep, so vast, that we need those kinds of minds in there looking. You never know what you will find when you look into this.
All right, who is Freddie Smith? Frederick Smith was a physicist at Oxford who discovered, when working with a discharge tube and a Crookes tube, that when he placed photographic plates near the discharge tube, they got fog. His great scientific conclusion from this was, and he so instructed his assistants, don't place photographic plates near the Crookes tube. Thereby, he did not discover X-rays. He left it for Röntgen. X-rays. Now, had he had the scientific curiosity to pursue that point, he might very well he would have then, certainly have discovered X-rays. Now, I have been talking about these two particular cases. I think, honestly, were...
My friends, I said it once and I'll say it again. The truth is much stranger than fiction.